Boker Tov, good morning, everybody. It is a fine day to be here with all of you, and it is freezing cold outside. Now, some of you who live in further north probably mocking me right now because it's always cold there, but here it is, what is it? It is cold. It's cold. I could see my breath as I was trying to unlock the door this morning. It is 26 degrees outside. Real feel is 6 degrees. And then there's that. So yeah, it is frigid this morning, colder than we're used to here in Texas. So it does get cold here in Texas. If you're thinking about moving to Fort Worth, Texas is a big place, of course. So, there's all kinds of regions. It's actually closer to go from Los Angeles to El Paso than it is to drive from El Paso to Dallas. That's how big Texas is. But in any case, it's cold up here in the Fort Worth area in the wintertime. Not as cold as, Oklahoma. My goodness, it's cold in Oklahoma. Or certainly not as cold as North Dakota or the planet Hoth from Star Wars, otherwise known as Wyoming. But otherwise, it can get cold here. So just note to self, if you're coming from, like the Bahamas or Florida, where, it's not cold. All right. So I want to read something here right quick because you're tired of talking about the weather. Let me pull up here. I'm trying to find it in the Tanya right quick. I'm using my other Tanya, so I don't have it marked. What is it? Shavat. Something interesting we read in the Tanya this morning. Je l'ai fait tout le temps, c'est toi la terre, merci ton. Je ne t'en pas tant, c'est toi. Where is it? 17th, it's the 19th of Shavat, isn't it? And where is this insight? Where did I leave it? I wanted to share it to you. That's the 15th of Shavat. Let me find it here. Talks amongst yourselves. Oh, here it is. Okay. Thank you, God. All right. Here, here's what it says. So remember, yeah, Jim, it's 2 degrees. It's cold. One of the coldest I've ever been has been getting gas at a gas station in Oklahoma. I've been a lot of different places. That's the coldest I've ever been. I don't know what it is about Oklahoma, but it is cold. So in any case, so this is the Tanya talking about the Torah. And when I read this morning, it reminded me of John chapter 1. So in John chapter 1, the famous place where it says the Torah was made flesh and so on. And so basically Yeshua is the word of God manifest. Yeshua is the embodiment of Torah, right? The Torah manifest. So, contrary to what you might read in Jewish websites or what have you, that all of that is just absurd and ridiculous and so far-fetched, and there's just no way. It's actually not so. If you read Kabbalistic literature, you will find that Kabbalistic literature pretty much supports everything, and not pretty much. It does support pretty much every. When I say pretty much, it's a habit. It supports what we read in the Gospels. But anyway, this is what it says in the Tanya. This is in Tanya chapter 23. It says, in the light of all that has been said above, we can better understand and more fully and clearly elucidate the statement in the Zohar that the Torah and the Holy One, blessed be He, are entirely one. Now that is something that we know. I've said it, I don't know, thousands of times, probably, at least hundreds, maybe scores. But in any case, the biblical idea / the Jewish idea is that the Torah and Hashem are one. They're one, and the Torah is God. Now, if we really internalize that, if we really bring that home and make it a part of who we are, it will clear up enormous amounts of theological mistakes. Because if we really, truly embrace the biblical idea, the biblical concept that the Torah and God are the same thing, a unified entity, echad, then there's no way that we could dispense with any aspect of Torah, because that would be necessarily dispensing with God. Chas v'shalom, that's not even possible. So that very deep mystical idea is extraordinarily important to understand. And as I said, if we can come to the grip of reality that God and his Torah are the same thing, then it will remove the possibility of a great many theological mistakes. But that's just the opening salvo. This is what it goes on to say. And the commentary in the Tikkunim that, quote, the 248 commandments are the 248 organs of the king. So there are 365 negative commandments, thou shalt nots. And there are 248 positive commandments, thou shalt. Thou shalt. You got to talk like that too, by the way. Thou shalt. You know, honey, bring my dinner hither. Don't ever say here. Let's drop, bring it here. Bring it hither. It just sounds more, it sounds better. Would you like thy coffee in thine bedroom? Yes, I would. Bring it hither. Okay. In any case, it's saying here that the 248 positive commandments are the organs. They're likened to the organs of the king. So already here we find that esoterically, I love that word, that the Torah is already understood as the internal organs, the embodiment of the king. So with Yeshua manifesting in a physical form as the Torah, all that has happened there is that what is understood in the subatomic, so to speak, mystical realm was actually manifest in the physical realm. On the one hand, people could say, well, yes, the Torah is the organs of God. It's the embodiment. Remember that flesh is an organ, by the way. Sometimes we forget that because we think of our organs as being internal, but the human flesh is an organ. Okay. So if we understand the Torah is already the organs of the king to include the flesh, so all we're talking about with Yeshua is that went from theological or mystical to practical. It came from the realm of that dimension into this dimension, you could say. He only transferred dimensions. But the reality is still found. This is what it probably means, by the way, talking about Paul's quotation, where he talks about, the commandments are a shadow, but the reality is found in Messiah. What's he talking about? Well, he's talking about that the reality is literally found in Messiah because he is the embodiment of those commandments. Just to give you an example. It goes on to say The commandments constitute the innermost supreme will and his true desire. Let's just pause there for a moment, shall we? Because remember that we're talking about Parashah Yitro here, okay? And Parashah Yitro is all about the giving of the Torah. So, which begs the question, what is the Torah? The Torah, by the way, is not the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments, just in case, just to throw this out there, the 10 Commandments, someone say, well, I follow only the 10 Commandments. Actually, did you know, we translate the word commandment in English, but it's actually not commandment. It's the 10 statements. These are basically paragraph headings. All the other commandments fall under the category of one of those 10, or excuse me, fall under the heading of one of those 10 categories. There really aren't 10 commandments as per se, it's 10 statements. In any case, it says the commandments constitute the innermost supreme will and his true, say true, his true desire. So that's important when we talk about will of God. So you're reading the Gospels and you're trying to discern, what's being taught. And one of the challenges is that people in today's day and age, particularly obviously people that don't study Jewish literature and don't have a context of things, they don't understand the idioms of the day or the euphemisms of the day. As an example, euphemistically, to say in the first century, will of God. Now, let me just pause and ask you rhetorically. I don't need you to answer necessarily. If I said, define will of God, what's the will of God? I would suspect and anticipate that I would get a whole host of answers, maybe even paragraphs worth of answers from people to articulate to me what is the will of God. And it would be all over the map. I do not believe, present company excluded, I don't believe that I would hear out of the mouth of anybody the one word answer that every Jew, particularly in the first century, would instantaneously give me when I asked that question. In other words, the people who were listening to Yeshua teaching in the temple, teaching on the mountain, teaching in the synagogue, etc., if he said will of God and I said, what's that? The one word answer would be Torah. Instantaneously. So will of God is synonymous. It's a euphemism for Torah. The problem is to give you another example of this, is another euphemism is the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. What's the yoke of the kingdom of heaven? Again, if I ask that question to the general public, I would expect a plethora of various eloquent explanations of the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. I would imagine that it would have to do with all kinds of things, such as being a servant or helping the poor, taking care of the widows, all kind of things. But in a word, in the first century, if you were sitting around the Jews who were listening in the temple to Messiah and so forth, listening to him teach, and I turned to, my bubby or Marzadi, more likely, and I said, hey, yoke of the kingdom of heaven, what's that? He would say to me, Torah. One word, Torah. These are euphemisms. These are common things that were said in the first century. The problem is when we read the Gospels, we don't know that. And therefore, we interpret them incorrectly because we don't understand the euphemisms. And I've said this example before, but it would be like somebody 2,000 years from now, and I was writing a book, and I used an euphemism that said something to the effect of, he really got lit. Which in our modern age, here in Los Estados Unidos, getting lit is a slang euphemism for he got drunk. But 2,000 years from now, in some other culture, getting lit may be interpreted that he caught himself on fire. And so there might develop some strange belief about our present day culture 2,000 years from now, that one of our big problems was we used to light people on fire for no apparent reason. And so these laws had to be developed because everybody was just getting lit. They got lit up. And it would, you can imagine some preacher 2,000 years from now in some foreign culture reading something that we read and saying the problem was that they would just get people lit on fire and they had to put them out. You know, you can imagine, right? And we're all sitting here 2,000 years earlier saying, no. He just had too much to drink. You see, it's a big issue. So this Tanya brings down that the Torah is what? The will of God. Who doesn't want to do the will of God? Isn't that what we strive for? Think about it. Zipporah, did you really think that? Or are you messing with me? I'm serious, Zipporah. Are you being serious, or are you just because Zipporah comes originally from Cuba? And Zipporah says, LOL, I thought it was getting really mad. Is that enough? And I'm not making fun of Zipporah at all. She did. Okay. She's serious. Okay. Thank you, Zipporah. This is an excellent example of the misinterpretation of euphemisms. And here we have, in our own time period, Zipporah, who comes from Cuba originally, now lives in, she lives in a terrible location on the beach of Florida. I feel so sorry for her. Has to look out at the ocean water every day. It's really sad. Pray for her. Lift her up. But she thought that getting lit meant you got mad. No, it means getting drunk. You know, it reminds me when I was in high school, I had a friend of mine. She was a female, and her name was TJ. It turns out her name was actually Tatiana, and she was from, at the time, Yugoslavia, which I don't think exists anymore. I did not know that TJ was foreign. Her accent was basically non-existent. And one time we were just out hanging out, you know, a bunch of us, and I used a slang euphemism. It wasn't anything terribly bad, but anyway, I won't repeat it because it's probably not, you know, it's kind of a little crude. It wasn't terrible, but yeah, anyway, doesn't matter. And she said, "What does that mean?" And I thought she was playing around. And I said, "What do you mean? What does that mean?" Because everybody knows what this means. And anyway, she said, "No, I really don't know what that means." And anyway, that's when I discovered, to my great shock, that she was a foreign exchange student. I did not know that. And anyway, then I've always been fascinated with accents and stuff. So I'd made her speak to me in her native language, which I didn't believe her that she was actually from Yugoslavia. And then so she proceeded to call her mother on the house phone there, because we didn't have cell phones. And she spoke to her in Slavic, I guess you'd call it, right? And anyway, that's a big long story just to tell you that it's somebody else who didn't know, didn't have the euphemism down. I was reading what Rebbetzin wrote. I've heard it said, "I'm fired up." So yeah, fired up means really mad. But that's another example. So that, not to belabor this, but there's a really great example of how you could say he got lit, he got fired up, and everybody's thinking, God bless America. These people back in the United States back 2,000 years ago, they just loved to just get people lit on fire. They had this obsession. They were like, what do you call it? Arsonists. They were, what's the thing where you're obsessed with fire? You're a pyromaniac. Is it pyromaniac? What is it called? You can imagine the sermons that would be developed. So it's a good example. So Torah is the will of God. And aren't we trying, pyromaniac, thank you, Shoshana. Aren't we trying to follow the will of God? And this is why this discussion, I think, is valuable, is because talking again about the giving of the Torah, don't we understand that the giving of the Torah is the will of God. See, when you put things in this context with I was going to say with people, but pardon me. Sometimes we have to put it in the context with ourselves, but when we say, look, Torah is not the law of God. I mean, it is, but let's talk about it differently. The Torah of God is the will of God. Who doesn't want to follow the will of God? What person in their theological right mind doesn't want to follow the will of God? Everybody does. Everybody loves God and everybody is longing to know his will and follow his will. Who doesn't want to do that? And the sad commentary is that people are desperate to follow the will of God, and it's right there in front of us, but we don't think about it that way because the Torah has not been expressed in that manner. The Rebbe says that burned me up. Now she's on a roll with the. You're right, but we do have a pyrotechnic problem. We're pyromaniacs in this culture. If you think about it, I got lit. He's fired up. It burned me up. We just like to play with fire. You can see from this would just be this would catch on like wildfire. We have an obsession with fire. I just realized that in America. Anyway, he rode his hog to work. There's another euphemism. Somebody used that before, I think. In any case, the will of God. So it goes on to say his true desire. This is okay. So it's supreme will and his true desire. Thereby giving them life, inasmuch as their very life and sustenance is dependent upon the performance of the commandments by the creatures in the lower world as it is known. There's a whole concept, by the way, that our Torah observance, our fulfillment of God's will is not just about ourselves and doing it, right? Because if it was just a situation of this is God's will and therefore we do it, and we do it because it benefits us in some way, maybe the benefit is just simply that we have a closer connection with God, which is, by the way, one of the definitions of the Hebrew word mitzvah. It means to connect, which that alone, that's a whole nother conversation, because a commandment, we view it in our English language, right? I'm speaking English to you clearly. But whether you're speaking French or Spanish or Slavic, I'm sure that when we say law, that has a certain connotation, right? I've got to do the law of God. But what if we change that word? Instead of saying this is a commandment of God, what if we change, instead of using commandment, and we use the other definition of mitzvah, which is this is the connection to God? Wow. Totally changes everything, doesn't it? This is the law of God. This is the connection to God. This is the commandment of God. This is the connection of God. This is the law of God. This is God's true desire. Wow. Changes the conversation. Completely changes it. This is why we have to understand these various definitions and what they mean. Okay. So it goes on to say, I meant to say that it's not just about our fulfillment of the commandments from the sense of personal gain or connection to God. That's all obviously important. But Judaism also looks at the fulfillment of God's will as having cosmic Um, what, I'm at a loss for an adjective. Cosmic consequences. And I think that as we understand that, it heightens our appreciation of fulfilling the will of God, aka the commandments. Why? Well, because it takes it from the selfish realm, and sometimes selfishness is bad, and sometimes selfishness is kind of good. It's not. It's okay sometimes to be a little selfish, meaning that hey, I want to connect with God. That is really a selfish motivation, but in certain contexts, it can be positive. Like, I want to connect with God. I want to help you connect with God, but I also want to connect with God. Okay. But what if we also looked at, in addition to all of that, we looked at the Torah keeping as our cosmic role in helping elevate creation and basically clothe God? This is one thing that the sages brought down, is that okay, on the one hand, God doesn't need anything from us, right? Obviously. He doesn't need us. He doesn't need angels. He doesn't need anything. He just is. I am that I am. On the other hand, God has set it up so that he needs us, so to speak. That, in other words, our mitzvah keeping play a cosmic role in, if you will, pumping life into the universe. And see, this to me is amazing, because just to bring it down on a very simple level, when you go to the grocery store and when you are doing something so mundane, such as Rebbe and I just did a couple of nights ago, searching for the best value of mayonnaise, totally mundane, and we're in the mayonnaise aisle, and she saw a brand of mayonnaise which we had not purchased before, or at least we don't usually purchase it, I guess. And it was the best value, you know. And as I'm putting it into the basket, she just says, kind of like, you know, it's like, this is how we breathe. She's like, it's kosher. It's kosher, right? And I just happened to glance at it, and, you know, with my stellar hawk-like vision, kidding, I happened to see the OU, and I was like, yeah, it's kosher. You know, it's kind of like, and like that, it wasn't like a big deal. We just were like, okay, good brand, nice price. It's kosher, right? Yeah. Put it in the basket. Let's go look for the rice. All right. So you do something like that, and you're like, okay, not realizing that by intentionally, and I'm just using this as an example, and you do this 1,000 times a day, ladies and gentlemen, when you make choices based on God's will. This is my point. I'm just using us as an example to encourage you, and that's simply this. By us doing something so mundane and so simple, we, to some degree, brought tikkun to the universe. See, we often think in order to really change the cosmic universe, we've got to do something monumental. We've got to save the baby from the burning building. No, you don't. You just have to do God's will, and as I just said in the Tanya, his true desire. And when you make God's true desire your desire, then you are somehow, in some way, bringing tikkun to the entire universe. Yes, you. When you, and I'm talking here about food, but it's, as you know, it's not limited to that. There's a whole host of things. When you're kind, when you give somebody a smile, when you pray, when you whatever, everything you do that's in line with God's will. And when you direct your life in line with God's will and you strive to follow God, okay, let's use that. Just trying to follow God's will, having it on your mind, you're bringing tikkun to the universe. One of the most, to illustrate the grace and mercy and compassion of God in Judaism is, I think, best illustrated by a simple story that I heard years ago. And it was a story that was told of a Jewish man who was not observant. And he was walking past the window of a synagogue in which there were men praying. And he thought to himself as he walked by, obviously with sincerity, he thought to himself, I should begin to pray like that. And this person, as a rabbi probably, who was telling the story, I don't remember exactly where I read this, but it was, the story was more important than the source. But he said that the moment that man even thought about the will of God in his life and how he needed to do better, instantly heaven crowned him with the crown of Baal Shuva. Naturally, that thought needs to develop into an action. We can't discount the fact that actions are important. They obviously, intentions have no value ultimately without action. And nevertheless, Judaism gives immense and enormous value to thoughts, both positive and negative. And in this case, just the thought of wanting to do God's will elevated this man to the status of Baal Tshuva. And that's really the point, right? Even when we orientate our life toward even desiring what God desires, you have to understand you're shifting planets. Man, I wish that we could all really understand that. When you orientate your life to do God's will, that's how little old me and little old you that are really compared to the cosmic stars, we're less than a speck of dust on the head of a pin. And yet, through what I just said, we have the supernatural ability. Our little speck of dust, microscopic speck of dust, has the power to shift planets just because we even desire to do what is most desirable to Hashem. That's the power of Torah in our life. And by doing it, we enable God to be clothed in all of his glory. And that's the power of the Sidra of Yitro. The giving of the Torah gives us the power to move planets. This is why Yeshua said, tell that mountain to be cast in the sea, and it will be so. Why? Because the mountain is made from Torah that you are implementing. End of our Aliyah today. Thank you so much for being with me. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Stay warm out there, friends. I think it's pretty much cold everywhere except for Florida. Everywhere else, it's cold. Until then, till tomorrow, we will wish everybody the best of days. May God richly bless you, and we'll see you tomorrow with God's help Shalom Aleichem.